Finding my socks. press it
It's
while
here?
oh. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, so please take your seats. All right, we're... Please take your seats. We're going to get started in about a minute. All right, good morning. Welcome to the launch of the Global Platform for Successful Teachers. My name is Tracy Willikusky. I'll be your Master of Ceremonies today. I would like to welcome our online audience since we are live streaming this event around the world in English, Arabic, French, and Spanish. You can also listen into those languages here on the handheld speakers. During the event, follow us and ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag #SuccessfulTeachers. We'll have time for questions at the end of the presentations. We have an exciting event and an impressive lineup of speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce our Vice President, Annette Dixon.
Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be at this event and being here particularly for the launch of the Global Platform for Successful Teachers. I think by definition, the fact that we are all here participating in this event, we understand that there is a global learning crisis. And so we are actually here, I think, because we are all looking for solutions that can help to intervene and fix this problem quickly. Now, of course, last year with the launch of the World Development Report 2018, Learning to Realise Education's Promise, we rang the alarm bell and we documented some of the challenges that school systems face around the world. This past annual meetings in 2018, we launched the Human Capital Project, which you all know, and with it we unveiled the Human Capital Index. And with this index, we have really drawn the attention of key policymakers in countries to this crisis in learning and the challenge that it presents for countries going forward. Now, this index has actually opened up an opportunity to have dialogue with leaders in countries who are not just ministers of education. And when we talk about the human capital challenges that countries face, more than anything, these ministers and leaders want to talk about education. They worry about two things. They worry about a perception that they have in the deterioration of the quality of education that they see in their post-colonial systems. These are developing country policymakers. So on one hand, they sense that the systems are not as strong as they used to be. And on the other, they worry that the world is rapidly moving on young people and that the future of work is creating a more demanding environment for education systems. So we are in a position now where we have the attention of heads of states, ministers of finance, and government leaders. They're listening. They're open for ideas on what can be done to intervene. We actually, in the Human Capital Project, we're working with countries that have actually expressed interest in actually accelerating progress in human capital in their index, and we're now almost at 50 countries that have stepped forward. Now, these countries actually span the whole spectrum from very poor, very fragile, through to middle income and even some high income countries. So with your help, we actually really need to work together to put in place smart strategies, which may include investments, which can be incorporated in government's thinking and can be at the centre of their effort to grow and compete for the next century. So, as you know, describing the extent of the problem is only the first step. These countries really want and need solutions, and that's why we're developing this engagement area, which is looking at successful teachers, because we know that successful teachers will be central to ensuring real progress in learning outcomes. Progress on learning outcomes requires improving teaching quality and navigating the political changes that are needed to make better teaching policy actually take hold in many countries. Teachers are the single most important driver of how much students learn in school. But of course, they're not the whole solution. And we know that households play a critical role as well. But effective teaching actually can transform the lives of students by making it possible for them to learn, gain new skills, and thrive so that they can contribute to their communities and countries. A growing body of literature points to the key role that teaching practices, such as the extent to which teachers check for understanding and foster critical thinking skills, play in explaining student learning. Now, this job is not easy. Teachers have the arduous task of catering to students with diverse needs, preferences, and abilities. And of course, and this is really where the household plays a role, because the readiness for children to learn starts, of course, in the early years. But to actually tackle this challenge, teachers need to be responsible for ensuring that all students learn and are engaged. And to do this, teachers need the most appropriate pedagogic support to ensure learning. Now, I think this is also a challenge for teachers in many developing countries, because they are, in many cases themselves, the products of old-style education systems, and they lack role models in modern pedagogy and what it looks like. So here, I think technology can be an excellent tool to improve learning, but it can only be a complement to make the job of the teacher easier, more fun, and more impactful. This requires that all teachers become digital citizens and are provided with the right professional development opportunities and support. In response to the need to continue supporting teachers' professional development, we have developed and implemented Teach, which is an open-source classroom observation tool designed for use in low- and middle-income countries. Teach provides a unique glimpse of what happens in the classroom, and it's intended to be used as a tool for professional development. It captures teaching practices that nurture children's cognitive and, for the first time, their social-emotional skills. Teach adds an innovative and much-needed tool to our broader efforts to help countries strengthen teaching in all its dimensions. Teach has already been piloted in over 1,000 classrooms around the world and comes with a host of complementary resources that governments and stakeholders can use, and the demand for it is soaring. Given the crucial role that teachers play in children's lives, addressing the learning crisis requires this kind of very concrete and practical support. So today's event is really well timed because it brings together innovation, loads of experience around this table and elsewhere, some technology and real-world examples of how we can bring these together at this critical time in international education. And as we expand our work with governments to help them implement their human capital strategies, these kinds of solutions are what our clients are looking for, and most importantly, are what can help to drive accelerated progress and the outcomes that matter for children and young people. As I think the WDR on learning emphasised, change is difficult, but it is possible. Many people are, of course, familiar with some of the global success stories, including Finland, where teaching is considered a selective and competitive profession, and where just 8% of applicants to Finnish universities' education departments are admitted. And for those of us who have met some ministers from Finland, they're very proud to tell us that they applied to be teachers and were turned down more than once. So they ended up as ministers in government. In this context, teachers are trusted, and the society invests in them and also expects a lot of them. In Finland, teaching is a respected profession, and this is a characteristic of all successful education systems. We're also seeing some success in low and middle income countries, in countries that are instituting reforms and in spite of some considerable political challenges. For example, in Mexico, the government recently introduced a standardized test for teacher candidates, despite some significant opposition. This led to substantial improvements in student learning in both mathematics and Spanish. Data from teachers' performance will be critical for designing more effective training that is suited to the needs of each teacher. In South Africa, a pilot program that provided virtual coaching to teachers through text messages and tablets proved to be as effective as similar in-person coaching and on-site coaching programs. In Peru, the government introduced and implemented a new teachers' law, which shifted the selection and promotion process from tenure to merit-based. Teachers and principals are now selected and promoted based on their performance, knowledge, efforts, and skills. Thank you, Jaime. So I think we conclude as one of the hallmarks of successful education systems is that they place a high value on teaching profession. And indeed, when we engage with teachers who are benefiting from this kind of support, they themselves become extremely proud of the impact that they're having on their students' learning outcomes as well. So to this end, today I'm really excited to introduce the Global Platform for Successful Teachers. We're kicking it off with the launch of Teach, as I mentioned, and the Successful Teachers, Successful Students Policy Approach paper, which sets out recommended principles to guide discussions on teacher policy, and which we're going to discuss today. So let me close by saying that I think we all appreciate that we have no choice but to act now and to act in a resolute and ambitious way. A student exposed to a bad or mediocre teacher will learn much less than if she is exposed to a competent teacher. And just 1 year of education lost to a student cannot be recovered, ever. So even if improving the status of the teacher's profession and supporting effective teachers is a difficult task, it's something that we all need to do now. So let's make sure that every classroom in every country in the world has competent, empowered, and motivated teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. We'll now hear from Tara Bate and Dave Evans, who will present on the Successful Teachers, Successful Students Policy Approach paper. This includes a set of recommended principles to guide discussions on teacher policy.
Thanks, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. Dave and I are very excited to present the World Bank's policy approach to teachers, successful students. So let me get started right away with a quote that Dave and I both like very much. Teaching is the profession upon which all other professions depend. And let's just take a moment there. So how many people in the room have an undergraduate degree? A master's degree? You know where I'm getting with this, right? It would be hard to get this far if we did not have fantastic teachers. And if there's one piece of research which is consistent across countries and researchers, it is that teachers matter more than any other educational input in schools. And there's a lot of research on this. We'll just give you a quick snapshot. First, most effective interventions work through teachers. There's been this very large review of interventions, which includes low and middle income countries, that looked at a range of education interventions, and they found that structured pedagogical interventions, where you give teachers lesson plans and training to support that, were by far more effective than any other class of interventions, some of which included school-based management, community-based monitoring, as well as computer-assisted learning. And we also know that giving students a good teacher can make a huge difference. Now, we have evidence from a range of countries that moving a student from a 10th percentile teacher to a 90th percentile teacher can make a big difference. In India, for instance, you can gain almost 4 years of schooling. That is a lot to gain. And in all of this, all these econometric analyses, what we sometimes tend to miss out is that teachers are a very important role model for students. For most students, they are the first and most, the adults with whom they get to spend the most amount of time in any given day. And the kind of conduct that teachers model makes a big difference for students. Now, we also know that many teachers are not very effective. And come on, it's a really difficult job. So just think for a minute, just pretend to be a teacher. And you're outside your classroom, you walk in, bunch of 50 or more students looking at you. Do you stand? Do you sit? Some of those students are fighting. Some have come on empty stomachs. Now, you're expected to teach them algebra by the end of the year. You're also supposed to make sure they're going to be good democratic citizens. They'll have the growth mindset. And meanwhile, if there's any time left, you must help them ward off any of the tough things they bring with them to school. Now, that's a really difficult job. I mean, I don't manage to do it with one child. So let's understand how difficult this job is. And what we know is that teachers get very little support in trying to do this job well. And this is where systems have been failing teachers. Now, at the World Bank, we have been working closely with governments to improve teacher effectiveness. In the past 2 decades, for instance, we've worked with governments in over 60 countries. And what we've learned from this experience and from the vast body of literature on teachers is what Dave and I have tried to embody in these 5 principles. And just to give you a quick snapshot, the first principle is make teaching attractive. The second is improve the quality of pre-service education. The third is promote meritocratic selection. The fourth is provide teachers continuous support through good professional development and school leadership. And the fifth, which is cross-cutting, is to use technology wisely so that you get the biggest bang for the buck. So let me start off with principle 1, which has 3 parts to it. The first part is to improve the status of teaching. Now, we all know that teaching, school teaching especially, is not the hottest job around. Varkey Foundation compiled the Global Teacher Status Index. And what they've done is they've gone to 35 countries, which includes low and middle income countries, asked a bunch of people, teachers and non-teachers, about the status of the profession. And guess what? Teaching does not come very high. And why does this matter? It matters because then we don't get to attract the kind of people we want to get into teaching. And those who are in teaching are not treated as professionals. Difficult as it is to improve the professional prestige of an occupation, there are still countries that are doing a lot. Chile, for instance, launched a very effective media campaign to be able to improve the image of teachers. And we have more examples in the paper. The second part of this principle is to pay a fair wage to teachers. Now, nobody is saying that teachers are doing the job for the money. But frankly, if they're worrying about making ends meet, they're not going to do a good job. Or if they're worried that their opportunity cost is not being met, they're going to treat teaching like a waiting room, waiting for the next job, right? And what we do know is that countries where teachers perform well, they get paid well. So in Japan or in Singapore, teachers are paid pretty close to or better than engineers and lawyers. So that's one part of the pay thing, the level. The second part is just the stress associated with the uncertainty of getting paid. Now, for instance, in Lao PDR, teachers get their salaries 70% late. In the DRC, they only get 60% of the salary. 40% goes, God knows where, but not to them. The third step is to invest in good career progression structures. Now, we know that in most countries, promotion is based on qualifications and years of experience. It is not based on other things that might be attractive for performance. We know that in good countries, that's not the case. For instance, in Singapore, teachers are offered one of three tracks, whether they want to be master teachers, whether they want to join a leadership track or a specialist track. And then they are evaluated, groomed, coached, and allowed to do the best that they can. Now, that doesn't happen in other countries. Now, before I move on to Principle 2, a quick summary of Principle 1. Make teaching an attractive profession by improving the status of teaching, by paying a fair wage, and by better career progression structures. Now, Principle 2 is on pre-service education. What we know from many countries is that pre-service education is not at all selective. Just about anybody can join a teaching college. In India, for instance, where you have 8 million teachers, you don't really have any qualifications that you need to have to join teacher training colleges. Most kids who more or less flunk their board exams in 12th, they get into one of these teacher training colleges. And that's where we need to change things. We know that countries, for instance, what Annette was mentioning about Finland, less than 10% of students actually make it. The second is to include a practical component in the teaching education program. Most teachers have not been inside classrooms or experienced the kind of teaching that they are expected to demonstrate. And, if you think about this for a minute, teaching is a performance profession. You're live in front of a class of 50 or more students. If you've had a bad day or if you're messed up, you're not able to teach a double-digit addition, or you're not able to get the kids to stop chatting, you can't just hit pause and leave the room or call up a friend or colleague and say, how do I solve this problem? You have to fix it right there and then. And the problem is that because pre-service education programs don't recognize this, they don't help teachers do better at this. And if you look at other performance professions, for instance, if you're a surgeon, where you have to perform live right there, or if you're a soccer player, it's practice, practice, practice. Ask a classroom full of teachers how much time they spend on practicing lessons before going into class. The answer will be an eye-opener. And the third part of this principle is to help the young people who come to become teachers redress some of the learning deficits that they bring themselves. It's not as if, though, having completed, say, 12 years of education or being in 12th grade, they have everything that they need in place. So sorry, that just went off, but we'll have to get that back. But that's it from me, which is that pre-service education has three parts to it that we have to get right. The first is make it much more selective. The second is to ensure that it has a practical component. And the third is to make sure that it redresses some of the learning deficits teachers bring with themselves. And Dave, sorry, I took away.
Thank you very much, Tara. So we've attracted these amazing candidates to the teaching profession, and we've prepared them well. So one comment that often comes up when we go to different countries and talk to ministries of education is we can't get the right candidates into the classroom. So part of that is attracting the right candidates, absolutely. But another piece of that is selecting the right candidates amongst all those who apply to actually come into the classroom. So the next principle includes policies for hiring and managing teachers, and what's the most effective way to do that? And we have three elements of this. First, we make sure that we select teachers on merit. The second, that we use probationary periods to assess effectiveness before giving the longer-term job security. And third, establishing systems to dismiss teachers that are consistently ineffective. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those. So first, in terms of recruiting and hiring, here we go. In terms of selecting teachers on merit. Now, you're not going to go to any country and they're going to say, well, our policy is not to select teachers on merit. So it might seem kind of obvious, but the fact of the matter is there are many countries that both historically and today have selected teachers for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with their cognitive ability or their mastery of the content or their their ability to say the word pedagogical. Or any of these elements. So historically, in some Latin American countries, teachers have had actually the power to decide when they retired who took the job after them. In some other countries, it's really a political reward for people who did good service in the last election. And there are other countries that have moved a little bit in different directions. Now, we have some evidence on this. There are a number of countries that are moving towards meritocratic. Annette mentioned Peru in her opening remarks. So we have some evidence from Mexico, which showed that when they moved to a test-based form of assessing teachers and deciding who would go to the classroom, it made a big difference on student learning. Now, the interesting thing about that work is that the test was actually not very good at predicting who would be a great teacher. This is one of the big challenges in teacher policy in high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries is predicting who's going to be a good teacher in advance. It's very difficult. However, what we've seen, see if we've got some. So what we've seen is that, here we go. Is that when teachers were selected meritocratically, when there was a test, many of the most ineffective or likely ineffective candidates didn't even apply. So meritocratic selection is helpful even when our tests are not perfectly predictive of who's going to be a great teacher in the future. So another example of where, so this is slightly different. So this isn't teachers, this is school leaders, but the principle still applies. So there's one municipality in Brazil, the municipality of Sobral in the state of Ceará, that has student test scores that rival those of many high-income countries. It's very impressive. And so recently a team from the World Bank sat down with the government of Sobral, and the mayor attributed a huge proportion of that to shifting from political selection of school leaders to meritocratic selection of school leaders. Selecting on merit, on ability, really matters. Okay. So the next part is to manage teachers on the job. Make sure, obviously, that they're in the right place and that they're performing their job effectively. So one key piece of this is using probationary periods to assess teachers and let them improve. So since we're not great at knowing in advance who's going to be an effective teacher, it's important to make sure that we have systems in place for those first few years to assess how good teachers are and provide them support so they can improve and make sure that they're up to the task. We know there's actually a lot of evidence that the first few years of experience matter a lot. Teachers get a lot better in the first few years. After that, experience doesn't actually make a huge difference. And so having a probationary period in those early years can make a huge difference. Second is, ultimately, nobody wants to let a teacher go, but we have to have fair systems in place to dismiss teachers that don't perform and that don't improve. Now, in order to do this, we have to have good assessment systems that actually evaluate how effective teachers are in the classroom, that aren't penalizing teachers just because they have, a group of students that didn't come very well prepared, that really reward teachers for their ability. But that said, it has to be part of the toolkit. So principle 4, once we've selected these teachers and we're doing some career management, the fourth principle is supporting and motivating teachers throughout their careers. So 3 pieces of this. One is in-service, giving useful tools and effective leadership, and finally establishing systems of professional accountability. So I've looked at teacher professional development in a lot of countries, and almost every country has systems of teacher professional development. Teachers go, they spend a day in like a hotel ballroom or a Ministry of Education meeting hall, and they hear some cool stuff, and then they go back to their classrooms and they just do the same things as ever. And this isn't a failing of the teachers. It's that all of us know that's not actually how people learn. So at the World Bank, we did some analysis which compared what programs of in-service professional development that actually translate into student learning do and how those compare to most national at-scale professional development programs. So here's what it looks like on 3 factors that really matter. So the blue lines are those programs that are actually linked to big increases in student learning. So programs that are linked to salary, status, or promotion. In other words, if the in-service professional development actually matters to the teacher's career, effective teacher professional development programs have that. A much smaller proportion of at-scale national programs have that. The second is follow-up visits. So it's easy to bring teachers into a ballroom and give them some information, but for them to actually change their practice, someone needs to go and help them implement that. That's more costly, but it's also essential for this being effective. And so again, we can see the highest performing professional development programs have follow-up visits. Only half of the national programs have those, and for almost all of the national programs, the number of follow-up visits is 1. A third piece of this is the opportunity for teachers to actually practice with other teachers, the skills that they're learning. Once again, we see the same thing. The high-performing programs have a much higher proportion of the time practicing, teachers learning in practical experience versus these national programs. So if we want teachers to improve, we can't just do professional development. We have to do professional development that's actually based on real principles that we know work. The second piece is providing teachers with tools and leadership. So in a lot of the countries that we work with, teachers actually come, they haven't had amazing preparation. They don't have an enormous total toolkit. So in some of those cases, providing very detailed, structured lessons can be really helpful for teachers. So basically, this is a script that you can use, and there's variation in how closely teachers need to adhere to that script. But these kinds of detailed teacher's guides can be incredibly effective in helping teachers give kids the foundations of literacy and numeracy, without which they just can't learn anything else. So some work from Piper et al. Reviewing evidence from a dozen countries shows that these teachers' guides can actually increase learning by half a year relative to teachers that don't have access to those. The other is leadership. Now, the principal focus of this presentation is on the teachers, but we've all had good managers, and a lot of us have had bad managers, and we all know what a big difference that makes to our effectiveness. And the same thing is true for teachers. So what this chart up here shows, work from Nick Bloom and others, shows that there's huge variation across countries in the quality of management in schools, and we see a clear link between that and student performance. Now, we have some evidence, and this is just growing, that it's actually possible to help school leaders to improve and become better. And like we learned in Sobral, Brazil, another piece of that is selecting these school leaders based on merit rather than for political purposes. So the last piece of this supporting teachers is helping teachers to stay accountable. Now, you come to the World Bank and you have an economist standing up here, and the immediate assumption is like, okay, teacher performance pay, and let's, dismiss low-performing teachers. Okay, those may be part of the package. In fact, the track record for teacher performance pay is incredibly mixed, and the places where it has been effective, it's been part of a much larger package. It's never been standalone. But in fact, if we think about what keeps us as professionals accountable, for most of us, it's not actually performance pay, and in many cases, it's not the imminent threat of being dismissed. It's a whole array of tools. Being observed by supervisors, people recognizing our success, observation by peers and the respect of our peers, professional coaching, professional development, certification. These are all pieces of this accountability puzzle. And when we put these together, we have actually seen systems, reforms in Washington, D.C., work that's been done in Chile that shows that comprehensive accountability reforms can actually help teachers to be the best professionals that they want to be and deserve to be. Okay, so a cross-cutting principle is technology. Now, all of these, attracting teachers effectively, preparing them, hiring and managing them, and supporting them, technology has a role to play in all of these, but it's not a magic bullet. So one thing that we've seen from hard lessons repeatedly is that technology works best when it complements teachers rather than trying to substitute for them. I've heard conversation after conversation with ministries of education where they say, oh my gosh, these teachers' issues are thorny, so let's just, let's throw some computers into the classroom and hope for the best. These have been well evaluated, and it virtually never works. That said, technology can help teachers be more effective in their pedagogy. So what works in different places varies a lot. It depends hugely on the base infrastructure that you have and how effective teachers are able to integrate the technology into their programs. So it's essential to test and scale effective solutions in context. And finally, remembering that technology will not solve an education system's problem. It will solve individual problems within that education system. So when we think about technology in education, we need to think, what very specific problem are we seeking to solve, and how do we see the theory of change that will take us there? So 5 key principles: make teaching attractive, improve pre-service, meritocratic selection of teachers, high quality professional development, and use technology wisely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tara and Dave. I'd like to now introduce Ezequiel Molina, who will present Teach, a free classroom observation tool designed for use in low and middle income countries.
Hi, thank you. So as Annette said, we are amidst a learning crisis. That means that a large share of children complete primary school lacking basic skills. But the question is, how could it be that after years spending all that time in the classroom, these children get out without knowing how to read, write, or do basic math? And then the second question after that one has to ask is, what is going on in those classrooms? How can it be that after all that time, nothing is materializing for those students? So what I'm going to give you first is consider a couple of examples of actual classrooms in low and middle income countries that we have witnessed as part of this study. So in the first classroom, the teachers arrive, tells the lesson objective, this is what we are going to do today, and then ask one student to please repeat it. So the student please repeat it. Then he goes for the second student and asks, can you say it again? And a second student said it. Then he goes for the third student. The third student repeats the lesson objective just as asked. Then the fourth student, then the fifth student, then the sixth student, 8 students go through repeating the exact same paragraph. And 10 minutes of the lessons are wasted. The second example, the teachers arrived 20 minutes late to the classroom, during which a student had nothing to do. When he arrived, he asked a student to come to the board and solve a math problem. The student goes, he's struggling a little bit with the problem. The teacher gets impatient, asks him to go back to his chair and ask someone else to do it. In the third case, the teacher, after teaching single division, asks a student to solve 4 by 2. Give 5 minutes to a student to solve it, while the teacher sits in the desk grading the exams, and then ask one student to volunteer and come to the board. The student comes to the board, solve it correctly, everyone cheer. So until now, everyone was happy. And then what the teacher does is she erased the solution of the problem and asked another student to come to the board and solve the exact same exercise. And then she erased it again and asked another one to come again and solve the exercise again. And we have more than anecdotal evidence. So this is not just a few examples that I picked. In sub-Saharan Africa, we know from research in 7 countries of national representative surveys that less than 1 in 10 teachers follow effective teaching practices. Just think about that. Less than 1 of 10 teachers follow effective teaching practices in the classroom. Similar results are found in Latin America, in parts of East Asia, in parts of South Asia. But what is most impressive of the graph is what we don't know. For most classrooms around the world, we have no idea what's going on. We may have our suspicions, but we have no idea what's going on. And it's not just us, no? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I know it or not. But it's ministers of education, it's unions, it's parents, it's head teachers. Nobody really knows what's going on. And think about that. We don't know what's going on. So how can we help these teachers? What other way we know of helping teachers if it's not by observing them and providing feedback to improve? You know, the examples that I just read before were not of bad teachers or evil teachers. They are just good people trying to do the best they can with the little support they get. So the biggest issue here is that we've talked a lot about how we fail students, but we have also failed teachers by not equipping them or providing them with the initial teacher education that they need, as well as the continuous professional development to be successful in the classroom, to become a great teacher, to actually change a student's life. So because of that, because we think that the first step on changing this tide is to measure what happens in the classroom so we can customize teacher education as well as the support that we provide. We develop Teach. So you will say, what is Teach? So Teach is a classroom observation tool for primary classrooms, grade 1 to 6. And our intended purpose, the intended use of Teach is for two things: for system diagnostic and for professional development. As a system diagnostic tool, Teach allows government to measure the effectiveness of their policies to improve teaching practices. As a professional development tool, Teach allows governments to identify teacher strengths and weaknesses. So, but why are we so happy about unveiling Teach today and having all you guys here? It's because Teach has some unique features that we are very proud of. The first one is that Teach measures times on task as well as quality of teaching practices all in one tool. The second is that the instructional practices described in Teach are allowed to nurture children's cognitive and social-emotional skills. Third is that we develop it for low and middle countries in mind and is adaptable to different settings. And finally, is that it's free and it's currently available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And as we are here, there are 3 teams, one working on translating it to Swahili, one working on translating it to Arabic, and another one working to translating it to Bulgarian. And finally, it comes with a suite of resources, of complementary resources that would allow to do the training of the tool, the data collection, and the analysis much simpler. So now I will devote the rest of my minutes, hopefully there are a lot, but I'm not sure, on telling you a little bit more about this. So first is what Teach measures. So as I said, measure 2 components, time on task and the quality of teaching practices. For time on task, we measure through a series of snapshots that allow to record both, whether the teacher is providing a learning activity to the students and how many students are on task. For the quality of teaching practices, we have 3 distinct areas: classroom culture, instruction, and social-emotional skills, that correspond to 9 elements and point to 28 behaviors. As you can imagine, if I tell you what those 28 behaviors are, I will take a lot of time. So I will go fast, but I will try to give you a glimpse of what the tool covers. So as part of the classroom culture, okay, something that I should say before is that, so these different behaviors will have low, middle, and high, depending the evidence we observe in the classroom, and the manual explicitate what is a low, what is a medium, and what is a high. And then after that, you score it from 1 to 5. So every element gets a score 1 to 5, and then we aggregate it across. So classroom culture measures whether the culture that the teacher creates is conducive to learning. And that means that the teacher treats a student respectfully, that respond to their need, that challenge gender stereotypes, if needs be, as well as set clear expectations, and redirect misbehavior by focusing on what the student should do rather than what they shouldn't. So it's not like a stop talking, but it's what they should be doing. On instruction, it measures whether the teacher instructs in a manner that deepens the student understanding, as well as promote critical thinking skills. So again, I really don't have time to go through all the elements, but I want to zoom in a little bit and check for understanding so you have a bit better idea of what does the tool do. So in check for understanding, we have three behaviors. For those of you that are thinking, what is check for understanding and why it's important? Check of understanding is one of the most important practices teachers could do, because if you just teach but never check whether people are following along or are understanding, then it's the same as if you haven't done it. So we have 3 behaviors. The first is whether the teacher uses question prompts and other strategies to determine the level of understanding. And now I want you guys to think when you were in classroom, either as a student or as a teacher, because I'm sure many of us have done this as a teacher as well. That is, you are in the classroom, you are teaching, and in the middle of the lesson you say something like, "Are you guys following along? Anyone have any question?" And then you feel the sign of relief when nobody actually asks a question. Or when people say like, "Yes," and the class moves on. And that is something important because, when you think about it, those are not good ways to check for understanding. Because imagine in this setting in primary schools, it's not that the student's going to say like, oh no, wait a minute, I didn't get anything what you said, can you please repeat? That doesn't really happen, so it's not a good way to check for understanding. Another thing that many of us, I'm sure, experience is being in a classroom, the teacher asks a question, the 3 students in the front row raise their hand, the teacher asks one of them, they answer the question correctly, and the teachers move on. But again, that is not a good way to assess a student understanding of the topic. And why that is because that's not a good sample. Those students that raise their hand are likely to know the answer much more than the students that didn't. So a good way to check for understanding would be to actually ask a question to random students of which you don't know whether they are going to know it or not. So the other one is, as I said in the example, the teacher sat in the desk while the students were doing independent work. Something that we know from research is that teachers should circulate the classroom because that's allowed to check what everyone is doing, make sure they got it, they understand the instruction. Also, when you scan the room, you realize if people are making the same mistake across, so you want to come back and say like, oh, I see you guys are having a problem with this, let me point it out so they can solve it. And finally, another big part of this is whether the teacher adjusts teaching to the level of the students. And I'm sure, again, we've all been in classroom that the teacher either goes too fast or too slow and doesn't allow to make sure to differentiate what are the different needs of the different students and how to make it work. So finally, socio-emotional skills. We expect the teachers to instill autonomy by providing students with choices on how to approach the task. And also allowing them to take meaningful roles in the classroom. We also have perseverance, in which, I set the example of the teacher that gets, angry with the students and get impatient because he doesn't know the answer. That's another thing that we know we shouldn't do. Because, failure and frustration are part of the learning process. So actually doing mistakes, interrogating those mistakes, making sure we understand why somebody did that mistake so we can identify the misconception and solution is a big part of being a good teacher. And part of that is having a positive attitude towards student challenges. And finally, social and collaborative skills, where the teacher makes allow students to participate as well as work together and develop their interpersonal skills. So the idea of Teach is that it gives us a language to talk about teaching that these teachers may not have had before, and translate these examples that I said before that are mostly anecdotal to actionable data that we can use to tailor, as I said, our teacher education program, but also improve teaching practices. So before I said that Teach was developed with low and middle income countries in mind, and it was adaptable for different settings. What that does really mean, low and middle income countries in mind? So we have three reasons why we said that. The first one is that in order to develop the content, we review the evidence of effective teaching practice in primary schools. And here is the advertising to our paper that you can download freely for our webpage, and I'm sure from the blog and everywhere else. But we also, through this process, we tested either live or with video footage the tool several times in 11 countries in low and middle income countries. So, and this goes from China to Uruguay and from Mozambique to Georgia, very diverse countries. And finally, we have a technical advisory board that had both people that have developed tools in the past, like Pam Grossman or Heather Hill, as well as experts in instruction for low and middle income countries. So the second one is that it is easy to use, or at least that's what we say, but you can try it and see it. So the first thing is why we said that is because it's short and simple. It has 10 elements. Each element is 1 page. All the examples that we've done is from low and middle income countries. It was observed and tested. This means that when we use the training data for Mozambique, Uruguay, Pakistan, and Philippines to actually make sure that that we address the misunderstanding and fine-tune the tool so it was easier to understand. And finally, we have frequently asked questions that harmonize the interpretation of the manual and has things like, what do we mean by consistent? So we make sure that everyone understands the same when he's using the manual. Finally, it's adaptable. What do we mean that it's adaptable? That we use local classroom videos to train local trainers. And these are allowed to anchor the behaviors in the manual to the characteristics that we find in the particular country. For example, we said that the teacher should treat all students respectfully. But what respectful mean in different countries? And that is what allows us to do using local videos. Finally, we have a modular approach. So it means that we can add additional elements at the request of the government based on their curriculum or standards of effective teaching practices. And the example that you can't see anything of what is written is also in Spanish, so it's not for you to read really, but it's just to show you that in the case of Uruguay, we work with the government and create two additional elements that they wanted. So up to now, you say like, okay, Teach is an awesome tool. But now what is the evidence that we have that this is the case? So one important thing that we always care about is reliability. What that is whether two different observers watching the same classroom assign similar scores. So do we have any evidence? Luckily, yes. So we have two types of evidence. The first comes from the training data, a certification exam. So at the end of the training, we get people to take an exam. We use 3 videos and get them to try to see if they are accurate enough in coding. So here we find that after 4 days of trainings, 90% of participants, that's the weighted average, passed the exam. And these were people that had never used classroom observation tools in the past. The second piece of evidence comes from reliability in the field. So in Punjab, Pakistan, we went to 845 schools. All of them were double-coded, means that 2 independent observers in the same classroom. And we find that 90% of the time, observers are within 1 point of each other. Remember, the scale is 5 points. And then 87% of the time, they are within half a point. So, okay, so I hope I convince you that Teach is reliable, at least in its application so far. But that information that Teach gathers is meaningful at all. You don't really care about a tool being reliable if the information that it doesn't convey is not meaningful. So the question that we ask ourselves is, using again the data from Pakistan, is do higher teacher scores predict higher student test scores? And this is the answer. So a 1 standard deviation increase in teaching practices as measured by Teach gives an additional 0.1 roughly a standard deviation increase in student test scores. And for you that are asking what sort of a standard deviation really means, for you to give you an idea, in value-added studies, what people found is about 0.2, 0.1, 0.2 standard deviation. So this would be half of the value added of a teacher, which would be huge. And this is controlling for teacher content knowledge, for teacher characteristics, student characteristics, class size, and a host of other variables. But I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions on this, and that's why we have another paper that validates the results of the tool. It's also online. You can, you can get it. And in the paper is also pretty cool because we look at item response theory, and we look at the different elements of Teach and how each of those work. And this was a work that we did with Andrew Ho at Harvard. So finally, and this is probably the coolest part of this presentation, is the suite of resources. And is what are the resources that we have to get you started on Teach? To simplify your life, to train, to do the data collection, and to do the data analysis. And we really thought about this. So you have from like the terms of reference of the Teach trainer to the actual programs that compute the descriptive statistics. But I really don't have time to go. Actually, I am -1 now. So I will tell you just the 3 key ones that I think that will interest, and you can explore after this presentation and after the panel, of course, all the different resources that we have in the webpage. So the first one is a training manual and a script. This is a 200-page document that tell you from like, welcome, I am Ezekiel, I am the teach trainer, to how to break the ice, what jokes you should say, and how then you can teach, if you get that. Then the second one is the data collection. You can do it paper and pencil, or you can do it electronically using Service CTO. It is in all these languages that I said before, and have built-in programs to make sure that you're not doing any mistakes. And finally, the coolest part of all is we have a program to get you all the descriptive analysis for all the tables and graphs that you need to analyze the data, as well as replicate all the validation work and the psychometric work that we did in the paper that I mentioned before. Everything is there, as well as a pre-built document that has, what is the methodology of teach. Like you see there is a graph of an element and the different behaviors and all that. So, I mean, it's pretty cool, really. And finally, is like, if you have a question, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but the first question should be, where do I get all of these things? And you can go to our webpage at www.worldbank.org education/teach, and you can find everything. So thank you.
Thank you, Ezekiel. I will now hand the mic over to Justin Sandifer, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and has kindly agreed to moderate our all-star panel, which will be followed by a moderated Q&A with the audience. So Justin, I'll let you take it from here.
Can everybody hear me? Good morning. So we do have an all-star panel here, and we have a bunch of stuff on the table. We have both this World Bank policy approach to teachers to discuss and a very concrete new tool, Teach, to discuss. And we have people with a wealth of experience in the field to bring to bear as well. So starting from on my left, we have Thomas Kane, who is professor of education and economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Moving on to the right, sitting next to Jaime, Eric Hanoshek probably needs no introduction for many of you, is Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow in Education at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Next to him, we have Emiliana Vegas, who is Chief of Education Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, and a former World Banker here. And next to her, Shwetlana Sabharwal, who is a Senior Economist in the Education Global Practice here at the World Bank. So I want to dive right in and start maybe with Rick. You've done a lot of work on the returns, why we care about all this stuff. What are the returns to raising learning quality and teaching practice around the world in terms of economic development? You've done some recent work on the value of smarter teachers and that selection margin of getting kind of the first theme that we heard about today, of getting people into the teaching profession. Tell us a little bit about what you've found and maybe your reaction to the presentations here.
Well, the first thing I want to do is compliment the presenters and the people who developed these materials. It's very seldom I go and pick up a review document that tries to get the big lessons out of the research and don't have some complaints. And in fact, these documents, I think, are exceptional in their review of what we know and in their clarity about how we should think about each of those things. So my compliments down the line on that. As Justin mentioned, I've been thinking a lot about the returns to skills across countries. And the answer is, except for this room, I never go to an audience where I am not convinced that people have underestimated the importance of improving the learning in classrooms. And when you look at the implications both for individual earnings and for national growth rates, in my opinion, schooling is the only thing you should be talking about, the skills of people and how you develop them. And we have some estimates that are all outrageously large, so large that people don't believe them. But if you cut them in half, people still don't believe them because they are so important. And so what I'm excited about, since Jaime first sent me the Teach document and what was in it, was the movement to take research into really concrete practice. And in my opinion, I had my first exposure to the World Bank something over 30 years ago, so almost everybody in this room was not here in this room. And when I started, I was amazed about the certainty with which people at the bank knew what to do and were telling countries what to do. And it was based upon virtually no evidence, but a lot of hard facts, the way that most schooling policy is done, where people have an idea and so they decide that's the answer. And what has happened in the evolution of this work over time is just improving on both the facts, so that when you say evidence-based policy, it actually has some meaning today where it didn't at some point in the past. It was just a slogan, but today it has meaning. And the work to translate it down to the classroom, I think, is exceptional. What we found in terms of all of the research on teacher effectiveness, which I think was well summarized by Tara and Dave, that this is the crucial element of learning, is teacher effectiveness, but we also know that it varies dramatically across classrooms. And what this is an attempt to both find out where the variance is, to help people figure out how to reduce the variance and how to move things forward. And so I guess commentators are usually supposed to be critical, but I have trouble being critical of this effort because I think it's the single most important policy programmatic thing that I've seen in the bank in 30 years. That's in simple terms.
I think you're going to get invited back with comments like that. We're going to see if we can mix things up more a little bit here in a minute. But all right. Emiliana, let me turn to you. There were several examples given through the presentations about reforms happening in Latin America. And this kind of challenge, which I've heard probably many times from your colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank about raising the status of teaching as a profession and bringing more capable people into the profession, is something you've been working on. Has LAC cracked this problem, or are countries in the region fixing this? And you're not allowed to just, say that Jaime did it all. Tell us what's working and why it is or why it isn't.
Oh, thank you. And I also want to second what Rick said about the work and the presentations that preceded. It's hard to be critical of something that is so well done and so evidence-based, and that is going to contribute to more evidence and to really improving learning. So thank you, and I hope that our colleagues at the IDB who have participated already in the training can also implement it in Latin America, and thanks for making it available. So yes, the big challenge is how to raise the status of the teaching profession and attract and train and motivate effective teaching. Diana Incapie, my colleague, and Greg Elacqua and Mariana Alfonso, we just finished a book on this. And we actually studied a lot of the reforms, including those that Jaime led in Peru. I think the big challenge is both to introduce the reforms, but also to sustain them over time. When I heard the presentation and the highlight of the Mexico reforms, and now we know that with the change in government, a lot of those reforms are at risk of, if not already being eliminated, that the Independent Institute of Evaluation of Mexico is being closed down, that, basically the whole effort to create a meritocratic profession in teaching, even if it was actually by any standard very weak, the standards were not great, but they were a step in the right direction, are being threatened. So I think building those coalitions, not just the enlightened policymaker, but also how does society really, how do you build support across different stakeholders to sustain these reforms when governments change, I think is a key question. And we're seeing that in Latin America. We do like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Brazil is another interesting example. In Argentina, even today, when we were presenting the book and actually discussing that 5 big countries in the region at least have gone in the direction of establishing selection processes that are based on merit and promotion processes based on evaluations. When you discuss that with the leading teacher institute of the country, they are in shock and they think it's a neoliberal idea still today. So it's a challenge, I think, and I think tools like these ones really providing support to teachers that are focused on what happens in the classroom has been missing in all of our work collectively. And I think this is really, I hope, going to be a game changer, because once we look closely at what teachers are doing and how they're receiving or not support, we can really channel that energy against evaluation and against data to something more productive. I would leave it at that.
Thank you. Let's keep moving down here and turn to Svetlana. You wear many hats, but the one that I know the best probably is your work in Uganda. And if I'm to sit here as an external observer of World Bank education work, I feel like I hear a lot about the issues that Emiliana just emphasized in Latin America, about raising the status of the teaching profession and the selection margin. And when I hear things coming out of the Africa region, and I could reference even some of your own work on teacher effort, and we hear a lot about absenteeism, and we hear a much more accountability and holding teachers accountable focused message. You think that's a fair characterization? Why do you think that is? Say a little bit about that, and maybe say a little bit about, I think your result about kind of, for those of you who don't know, it's like Lake Wobegon, for those of you who know the American reference. All the teachers think they're better than average in Uganda. Everybody thinks they're trying harder than average, and trying to correct those perceptions, I think, is something really interesting you've teased out.
Thanks. So, the fascinating thing about any discussion on teacher policy, especially in a mixed group, is that it instantly and invariably can turn into war, right? Especially with questions like this, because then you are saying, well, one side is saying, teachers are these heroes, they go into these overcrowded classrooms with neediest children, no resources, no support, and they teach them. And then you have some penny-pinching economist saying, well, these teachers are consuming 80% of your education budget, and they are not in class 44% of the time. Ezekiel's study has found that. And this is where it gets really complicated for innocent people like me. But the truth is that a workable solution to the teacher issue will be possible only if we have the capacity to hold both these ideas at the same time, because both these ideas are a version of the truth, right? So, this profound kind of paradox comes out when we interviewed about 16,000 teachers across 8 countries. We found that 80% of them felt that they should be held accountable for student learning. In fact, 63%, to Dave's point about promotions, Dave and Tara's point about promotions, 63% said they supported the idea of their promotions being somehow linked to student learning, right? And in the same survey, minutes later, half the teachers said there's little they can do to help a student learn if he doesn't have the necessary concepts, right? More than 60% said that they can't really help a student if he doesn't have the materials or if his parents are not involved in his education, in his or her education, right? So these two paradoxical ideas exist, and they exist within classrooms, within the same teacher, right? So my sense is that this work is super important, it's super promising, it's going to help us disentangle precisely where to operate within the paradox. But the long-term solution has to come from getting the system to prioritize mastery of key skills for all, not these over-ambitious curriculum. My personal hypothesis is that the paradox exists because teachers are being pushed day and day to finish ridiculously ambitious curriculum. So they have no choice. So they rationalize their behavior by saying learning is equivalent to completion of curriculum. The only way I can finish my curriculum is if I focus on the top 10% of the class, which can keep pace. Because if I start focusing on the 90% of the class that's behind, I'm never going to get done with this curriculum. So I think we have to get in some ways, the most, I would say, brilliant solution to this problem of teachers might lie outside teachers by really getting the system to prioritize achievement of key skills, mastery of key skills by all. Thanks.
Okay, so let me now turn over to Tom. As the World Bank turns its attention to effective teaching, measuring effective teaching, trying to cultivate more effective teaching in its client countries, you've been both on the research side and, somewhat on the bleeding edge of taking that research into the policy domain in the U.S. on measuring effective teaching with the Gates Foundation. Some people in the room will be deeply familiar with that narrative, and some will have never heard it before. Tell us a little bit about what we've learned from the U.S. experience on measuring effective teaching.
Thank you, Justin. All I can say is what I've learned, and what I hope many other Americans who were involved in the teacher effectiveness reforms of the last decade also learned, because I think it's really important. So I enjoyed David and Tara's description of the 5 principles. It's a really ambitious vision for a change in teacher effectiveness policies. But I could imagine many people are wondering, okay, so where do we start? What are the initial places to get going? And I would just emphasize 3 that are areas. Number 1 is in the evaluation space, focusing on the probationary teachers first. And in fact, ensure that you've done a good job improving the way in which you're evaluating and providing feedback to probationary teachers before moving on to more experienced teachers. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made here in the U.S. was expecting states to roll out better approaches to teacher evaluation across the whole teaching force. And just given the large numbers, given the political pushback, it was almost guaranteed to fail to try to pick up such a heavy burden to start. So starting out with probationary teachers, and the good news there is, depending on the demographics of the teaching force, it could be that over the course of 5 or 10 years, you're reaching the majority of teachers anyway, rather than sort of taking on the political challenge of tenured or more experienced teachers. A second area where I think is important to mention, it's been a big part of the resurgence in interest in teacher effectiveness policies here in the U.S., but I haven't heard anybody mention it yet, but it really is central, and that is the existence of annual testing in consecutive grades. Why is that so important? Well, if we're going to be measuring, the effectiveness of teachers, and not just, I'm not saying this is useful just for accountability purposes, although obviously it is, knowing where students started at the beginning of the year and how much progress they made over the course of the year would be critical for informing your evaluation of probationary teachers. But even aside from its use as within an accountability framework, having the annual testing allows you, at least in a certain grade range, say annual testing grades 3 to 8 would allow you to measure gains in grades 4 to 8. That is critical for all sorts of things. So say if you were trying to improve the quality of your teacher preparation programs in a country, well, I would encourage nobody to try to do that on a broad scale. First doing it as a pilot, having the annual data would make it possible to measure the achievement gains for the teachers that had graduated from such a program. And if you don't have those kinds of data, you're likely to make horrible mistakes in scaling up programs that are ineffective. I realize that doesn't sound like a very sexy, thing, testing, but it really is central to being able to make progress. And at least in a certain grade range, having annual testing in consecutive grades will really pay off down the line. A third area, third place I think it's worth emphasizing is, so David and Tara talked about the importance of raising the status of the profession, and salaries inevitably become part of that discussion. As everybody knows, I'm sure, raising salaries is a very expensive step. And there's a really critical challenge in the transition, because you've got a lot of folks that were recruited into teaching or in the classrooms maybe when teaching wasn't such a high status profession, and yet if you provide higher salaries would give them an incentive to stay in the profession. In this case, though, in the case of teaching, we're helped because of all of the evidence that teachers improve during their early years of teaching and then flatten out. What that implies is, if you're going to invest in higher teacher salaries, it would be important to invest it primarily in the immediately post-probationary period, and then during the subsequent, 5 or 6 years. So in effect, dramatically flattening out the pay schedule, where most of the marginal increases in salaries are going to early career teachers and then flattening out. And you might say, well, gosh, doesn't that mean, that we're going to have issues with retaining folks in the classroom? Well, remember, if people are improving their teaching dramatically in the first years and then flatten out, it would be much easier for education sectors to be competitive for the very top flight students during that, 6 to 8 years early in their career, rather than trying to compete for their keeping them in teaching for their whole career. Because in other industries and by moving from job to job, people typically improve their productivity over time. So rather than whereas in teaching, I was just saying, actually, we don't see that. So rather than try to work against the grain, exploit the fact that that teaching could become much more competitive for these very high performers early in their career, I think makes sense.
Excellent. There's a couple of those issues I want to take back to the rest of the panel. One, and I would throw this open to anybody, but one of the things that you emphasized there, Tom, was the need for data as a prerequisite to a lot of this work on improving teaching effectiveness. And maybe Emiliana can speak to improvements in the existence of that kind of data and annual testing of consecutive grades in the Latin American context, and where that exists and where it doesn't. In a lot of the countries where a lot of the people in the room will be working, we're really far from that, right? annual testing of any grade, or even, every few years testing of any grade on a small sample is sort of an ambition in many cases. Where does that leave us in terms of systematically improving teacher quality?
Okay, I'll start, and I'm sure others will complement. In Latin America, a little bit, Tom was saying earlier, in this country, when really a lot of work started after we had better data, after there was annual data on student in terms of really studying teacher effectiveness, because prior to that, you didn't have good data. And in our region, the one country that really has had very good data for many years is Chile. And if you see the kind of research on education systems in Chile, it's one of the greatest bodies of analysis in education as well. But other countries have followed suit. And again, it seems like it's a political issue. It becomes a political issue when it's used particularly for accountability purposes and not so much for improvement. And there are, I think, two issues here. One is that, like you were saying, a lot of countries that have been developing assessment systems don't think of the use of them to improve. They use them more for taking the temperature in the system, in the weakest case like Uruguay, and kind of not really making a lot of policy decisions based on that. And then they usually do sample-based assessments. So you really can't intervene with those data at the micro level, at the student level or teacher level. And then you have countries that have, like Colombia, invested a lot in testing census-wide, at least in some grades for many years, and then change in administration, and they suspend all testing for a year and kind of cut your ability to look at trends, and now are considering seriously going to do sample-based testing instead of census-based, which, we're strongly advising them not to do, but in the end, they make those decisions, obviously. So it's a challenge. I would love to hear from Tom and from others how, because I think there is the issue that it is expensive to conduct high quality student assessments, and these, most of the countries where we work are low income or middle low income, but also what is the cost of not doing so? I think I know Rick can speak to that very energetically.
Make the case for standardized testing for us here, Rick.
Well, I mean, I first encourage everybody to go to the WDR for 2018, which I thought had a very thoughtful and evidence-based discussion of the need for more testing in the world, not less. And I thought that is something that people should go back to. As Emiliana mentions, there is this political tension with tests, and there are multiple uses of testing information. Often it's all lumped together. If we look at the more developed countries and across developed countries, the use of standardized tests to compare schools and provide information on schools is one of the few things that we know of that leads to higher PISA scores and higher international testing scores in math and reading. And so just providing that in some manner is important. I think that many of the lower middle income countries have no idea how far away from the OECD mean they are. If you go to these countries and you ask them about how your schools are doing and so forth, and how are your students doing, and they say, oh, we're doing very well now, thank you. And they're a standard deviation or a standard deviation and a half behind the OECD mean, which is that the right standard? Well, I think it is, actually, because we have become so globalized in production that these are the competitors. And it's not that Kenya is competing with Tanzania. It's Kenya is competing with the rest of the world. Now, the use of annual testing, I certainly approve of in many ways. And how you introduce that is a real question. I have mixed reactions to it because of the political pushback to annual testing that immediately allows you to evaluate individual people, and then that becomes a political issue. And so in some ways, I think broad-scale testing is absolutely essential. Whether you start with annual testing or not, I think is a political issue that depends upon the individual country. I think it's essential for the research purposes that Tom mentioned, that if you want to understand how programs and various policies are operating, I think it's almost essential to have annual testing. But you might do that, start with some sample for policy research evaluation purposes, and then try to move it in. But this is getting a little bit out of my area because we're starting to talk about the politics of developing countries, and that's not me.
So Rick was an important contributor to research on teachers, 4 decades ago. And then there was a period where it was Rick and maybe a couple other people that were paying attention to teachers. And the whole teacher issue came back on the screen here in 2002. And you say, gosh, what happened in 2002? Well, that was the year of the No Child Left Behind Act, when suddenly it became possible initially just to do research. So I totally agree. I even as an economist, I recognize it would be political suicide to start out to say the reason for doing this annual testing is to hold individual teachers accountable. I know that's not the place to start, and not just as a political rationale, but also just not as, I don't think that would necessarily be good practice. But all I'm saying is to lay the groundwork for evaluating teacher training programs, evaluating different curricula, for even just measuring the degree of variability from teacher to teacher in terms of student achievement gains. Having annual testing is indispensable. And then maybe down the line there would be accountability uses, like for the probationary teachers in particular. But it would be hard for me to imagine building internal momentum behind a teacher effectiveness reform strategy based purely on evidence that comes from the developing world, or from the developed world, or from a World Bank report. That for laying the groundwork for building a political mandate in any country around teacher quality reforms will require local evidence upon which to make that case, and I think it would be, without the annual testing, it would be impossible to do.
Okay, let me, whoops, keep that on. In a few minutes here, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, but I'm going to look at the ones that I've just been handed that are coming in online, and some of them are conveniently things I wanted to ask you anyway. So, well, let's put this as provocatively as we can. I woke up this morning and looked on Twitter, and Dave Edwards, the Secretary General of Education International, the umbrella organization for teachers' unions in the world, has already written a blog post about the Teach tool and about this event today. And I think kind of the best line might have been, would a World Bank economist accept having their appraisal conducted by any random citizen untrained in economics? The Teach tool is designed to be done by, untrained enumerators, essentially, who are not expert teachers. But the tool is quite insistent that it's not necessarily an evaluation, a performance evaluation tool. And I see Svetlana nodding. So I want to ask you, and the question we got from online was like, well, how does this help us in formative evaluation. How do we use this? We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have census-based annual testing to link this to teacher evaluation. How are we going to use the information from this tool, and are we just asking untrained enumerators to evaluate professional teachers?
Sure. I should maybe nod less vigorously, but so I think the idea is, I mean, the central challenge with this, I think, which Ezekiel and others also pointed out, is that we don't necessarily know what makes a good teacher, right? We know absolutely nothing about it in low-income settings, but we do know quite a bit about what would make a bad teacher, right? So there are, like, absence would make a bad teacher, an ineffective teacher. Some of the examples that Ezekiel mentioned at the start, we all instinctively know that these are suboptimal teaching practices, right? At the same time, we know that teaching is, changing, influencing teacher effort has been nearly impossible, right? Because it is so discretionary. It is so transaction intensive. A teacher makes thousands of minute decisions during a class, right? How much attention to pay, whether to ask a question or not, whether to stop and pause and repeat or not. That monitoring it and really kind of in a systematic way influencing it is just nearly impossible, right? So I think, this is our problem, right? We know what teachers shouldn't do. We don't know very much about what makes a teacher effective, that we can, just put it in a glass and give it to them. And we also need to solve this problem urgently. So I think what Teach is trying to do is help, at least on the margin, where we know this is not an optimal practice, right? And the most effective way Teach can actually influence things, I mean, I'm an economist, so I can find a problem with every solution. So the biggest challenge would be how you socialize it to the teachers themselves. So I think some of these warnings are sort of merited because, as everybody knows, the teachers as it is are not very motivated. And then on top of that, if they look at this tool and say, oh, what fresh hell is this, then it's doomed, right? So we have to, and this applies a little bit to the question of assessments as well. We have to imbue these things as they're being delivered with meaning, with real meaning for the individuals that it's touching the most, which is teachers, right? So imbuing it with meaning is very possible given the way Teach is structured, right? These are some of the things that will make you more effective, that will make your job easier, that will help your students. And doing a very clear communication strategy, listening to teachers as it's being rolled out, and also doing some good research on, are there social psychology, mindset shift type add-ons, framing add-ons, communication add-ons that we can do, which lets teachers get the most out of it, right? Their enthusiasm for teaching as a whole, but also for this tool, will depend on whether they think it has meaning. And the last thing you want them to feel is that it's taking away from their autonomy. Thanks.
Great. I should open it up here because we're short on time, and I think maybe we should do this in rounds. So if you have a question for a specific member of the panel, make sure you clarify for whom. But let's take a few here. And I'll do in-house favorites to my Center for Global Development colleague, Barbara Bruns in the back. And then directly in front of her, and can we get one more? Yes, the gentleman here in the vest. So, Barbara, please.
You need a mic.
Oops. Aha. I failed in the logistics. So yes, you either need to come to a microphone at the back or borrow one from around the table.
I'm Barbara Brunn, Center for Global Development, ex-World Banker too, and I just want to join the bandwagon complimenting this team on amazing work. I mean, I think the instrument, I think this paper are really transformational. So my question is, Principles 1, career progression for teachers. Principle 3, meritocratic selection and the ability to have a strong, meaningful induction period. And Principle 4, having evidence-based professional developments, presumably meaning that you're able to see whether the professional development actually changes teachers' practice and then has an influence on the influences we expect on student learning. All of those really have an evaluation component. And we were just talking a little bit about the politics of evaluating teachers, especially in an environment where there's really isn't good learning outcome data. So, you know, the spiel from Ezekiel and everything is that this is a formative instrument. This is an instrument we'll use to give mainly to kind of do diagnostic of the system and give, you know, useful feedback to the entire system. But if this instrument cannot or should not be used to help in those evaluation processes for teachers, what should be? And is there a danger if it does become associated with that?
Excellent. Let's gather a few here, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Alejandro Lara, and I'm currently doing my doctoral degree in global education. And it's interesting because throughout the meeting, it's very, very interesting. And I was able actually to write down probably 4 or 5 pages of my dissertation. I'm going through my dissertation process right now as we speak. But I'm just wondering, I understand that the purpose of today's meeting is to targeting at one segment of the student population, and also targeting teachers at one segment of the teaching population. I was wondering if it's in the outlook, it's in the forecast, it's in the future, targeting, because the teaching profession, as you all know, is at different levels, right? Specifically, I'm talking about lifelong learning. How do you envision this platform to work, perhaps, at a later stage in life? That's one of the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more here, please.
Yep, thank you very much. My name is Diego Angel. I'm senior economist in Latin America, working on Chile and Ecuador. And I have a question for Dave and Tara. And basically, in the average country in Latin America, sometimes we have about 40% of the schools and 15% of the student population, which goes to escuelas unidocentes, which is basically one teacher or two teachers. And sometimes these policies that you mentioned, which I think are great for the average school, don't trickle down to them. They don't have access to technology. Basically, sometimes they don't take pre-service training. Some of them are not even evaluated. Some of, like in Ecuador, these unidocentes schools don't get into the teacher assessments. They don't have management because they don't have a director. So in those cases that are kind of is kind of a particular segment of the population that these policies don't trickle down necessarily to them, how do you create successful teachers?
Okay. Let's give our panel a chance to come back on that, and we'll try to fit in another round if time permits. The first one I want to see if anybody on the panel wants to take. Like if this is not supposed to be evaluation, and this is supposed to be formative, like on what basis are we going to do evaluation then? And in particular, I think I want to keep coming back to, suppose I work in a system where we don't have value-added modeling. We don't have this tool on a kind of census basis. Do we give up on evaluation? How are we going to do actual evaluation? Anyone dare to?
I mean, I would say initially just what Tom was emphasizing, that this is a clear evaluation tool at the probationary stage. I mean, that you would use this information, I think, at the probationary stage. Where it gets tricky is when you talk about the rest of what you do for the stock at some point in time, but that this provides a basis for counseling new teachers on how they should behave or be reacting with their classes and helping them out. But then again, if they don't change over the first 2 or 3 years, you also have information that I think should be used.
So early on in the U.S., the teacher evaluation reforms actually did receive some support from the labor movement here. I remember Randy Weingarten from the AFT giving a favorable speech at the National Press Club not far away. And, you know, of course, the politics of that changed. But the reason, I think, or a couple of reasons why labor unions might be brought in to be supportive of if you were starting with probationary teachers, is it improves the legitimacy of something they really care a lot about, and that is the longer term job protections. And so if the system can point to, okay, well, if there are going to be longer term job protections, then we've got to make sure that there is a serious hurdle before people get tenure, then that's not striking at the heart of their membership, and it's in fact actually reinforcing something they care a lot about. A second, though, goal of the classroom observation tool, Ezekiel, that I agree with everybody was fascinating and I think will prove useful, is in providing a common vocabulary for teachers. People underestimate that. People think, okay, well, teachers talk to each other about effective teaching practice. Actually, no, they don't, because there's no common vocabulary. And when you think about it, individual teachers are working by themselves all day. And you're doing a very useful service just by providing adjectives and breaking up what is a very complex profession into, different chunks, and giving people reference points for describing how their practice fits with each of those standards. So thinking about ways to try to promote the use of this tool for teacher-to-teacher conversations in schools. Of course, if it's used as the evaluation tool, they have a reason to talk about it. But might there be other ways where you make it easy make it possible for teachers to observe each other and score each other, even just purely for feedback? Again, even if they're low stakes, by getting people to start conversations around how their practice stands against these high standards, I think would be a useful process.
Justin, can I add something?
Yeah,
to
please.
This? I just wanted to say that I think besides working with probationary teachers, one possible route to addressing some of the concerns that Dave Edwards put today in the blog is working with teacher education institutions, because they also are weak and they don't have a lot of tools to kind of really do a good job themselves. So starting with that is probably a good way to socialize the tool, develop this common vocabulary from the get-go. I think that would be promising, and they're in need of support as well.
So let me turn to Tara and Dave. You had a question from Alejandro on lifelong learning, Diego Angel's question from the Latin American context, and I think I just heard Rick Hanashek and Tom Kane say that you actually do have an evaluative tool, and that you're not going to, you don't get to be so warm and fuzzy about saying this is only formative. But maybe I misheard. Do you want to come in on either of those points? Yeah.
I'll just say something briefly. Alejandro, you're right. We're not principally talking about kind of lifelong learning here. The World Bank is doing some good work on this. I know Victoria, who's here. Raise your hand, Victoria, so Alejandro can find you afterwards. And Magdalena, who's here. I'd recommend talking to them about the work that's happening on that. Just a short thing on Diego's point. I think there's a lot of, you have these classrooms like, oh, the teachers, there's no pre-service. I mean, basically, if there are no good principles of managing teachers in these classrooms, the only way to help those teachers is to put some of those principles in place. And so even in those schools, there are possibilities for ministries of education to send coaches to help teachers get feedback using this instrument or other sort of tools. Providing teachers at least some of that diagnostic feedback doesn't necessarily help completely with the motivation challenge, but it can make a real difference in terms of them getting concrete evidence about how to improve their practice.
No, nothing to add to that.
So on the evaluation, so I think that the way we are looking into this is that in many of these countries, as the examples that I was describing, these teachers had received zero support. So it would be kind of difficult to evaluate them with a tool that has an idea of what effective teaching practices are and provides a standard. But I do think that, for example, in many countries where we work with the tool, something that we do is make sure that this is attuned to their standards and make sure that it's not just a tool, but a lot of things have to change. As Emiliana was saying, is they can change the continuous professional development that they do. So they actually teach teachers to do these practices. And then it makes sense to check whether they are doing, provide feedback. And after a while, after you've done all these steps, some of them will be better and some of them don't. And I think that's how I view the difference between formative and evaluation. But I think just say tomorrow we're going to use this for evaluation in Argentina, I don't think that would help.
Well, there you I think in the interest of time, I've already gotten the note that I'm supposed to be wrapping us up here, so I have to break my promise on a second round of questions. Why don't we, before we turn over to Annette and Jaime to close, maybe a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all for your contributions. And then I'm looking at Jaime for direction. Are we going to go to Annette for some closing remarks, please?
Well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I just want to note 4 things that this discussion has provoked for me as things to think about going forward. The first is this discussion about teachers and their evaluation. For me, the question is the teacher the right unit for evaluation, if any, or is it the school? Because for me, there's this assumption that there is a single teacher in a single classroom with a single group of kids. To me, it doesn't sort of gel with what I see in schools. I go from community to community all over the world, and even in the same sort of neighborhood, you can see huge variance in the schools, the quality of the school. And I think, teaching is often a team effort. Teachers support each other, and there's, if head teachers are doing their job, they're supporting teachers. And sometimes you do have team teaching. So a question for me is, what is the right unit to focus on? Is it the individual teacher assuming that they are on their own or they're part of a team? Second is, what's the role of learners in all of this? This is it's an interactive process. And I say this because years and years ago, when I worked in my own country, New Zealand, there was a study conducted, I guess it must be 30 years ago now, where a researcher put microphones on the children, and the idea was to monitor their reaction to the teachers. And actually what they found, they picked up a huge number of data points about the conversations kids were having with each other and the extent to which they were supporting or undermining each other's learning. This study was famously called "Take Your Brown Hand Off My Book." So you get the drift of it. And so actually it opened up a whole sort of, I think, interest in how kids are actually responding and how kids' own interactions. There's a teacher here, but there's a whole community of kids interacting with each other that's sort of like below the iceberg. And I think is really important. So, and the third is the role of parents. And again, my New Zealand bias comes up because, I grew up with this sort of idea that teachers need to share the learning goals with the parents, so the parents are supporting the same learning goals and are part of this process, and that schools are more effective and teachers are more effective if they actually have a partnership with parents in this learning process, and indeed welcome parents even into the classroom. And that's not, in most developing countries, that's a no-no. They do not want parents anywhere near the schools. And then lastly is, what is the role of the teacher in the world of the future? And I just want to borrow from Jack Ma for a minute, because his thing is that the role of schools in the future is to teach things that machines can't teach. And so I think that if you believe that's going to be true, then that means that this focus on teachers teaching the social and emotional skills that they themselves need to exhibit becomes even more important. So this process of supporting teachers in this part of their job, which is getting even more important, becomes even more critical. And hence, I think, the relevance of the study and the tool that we're launching today to actually this part of the discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Annette. And I want to start thanking the team for all the hard work during this last few months or probably years. On one hand, on the development of this tool, on the other side, all the thinking and discussions behind the approach paper that are basically one first step, right, of this global platform that has the intention of making sure that we are each time better equipped in order to support countries, right, in one of the most critical reforms that they have to implement. If we say what are the critical factors that will have to go in order to have a good education system that really is focused on learning, I think it will start with what Annette was saying, the prepared learners, right? But the other factors will be teachers having the right technology for learning, having good management of the system, right? But of those four, one that is absolutely critical is teachers. I mean, in our lifetimes, most likely still, education is going to be a human interaction intensive endeavor, right? It's not going to be about technology, although technology could be extremely helpful in order to augment the capabilities of the teacher, in order to enhance the effectiveness of the teacher. But it still is going to be an activity in which the human factor is going to be absolutely critical. So if there's one thing in which both the World Bank education practice that the Human Capital Project is focusing in is on this human factor, right? And it's something that is absolutely central, right, for the reforms that countries have to implement. And it's very important not to think of this discussion if is it teachers or technology. No, it's technology in order to support the work of the teachers. Because precisely as Annette was saying, what we are asking teachers is each time more difficult, right? Is each time less about knowledge, and it's more about nurturing a set of complex emotional skills, right, that kids have to have. And doing that, as Tara was giving examples, is very, very difficult. Now, many of the traits that we in this presentation, that we saw as the desirable traits of teachers, in many of the examples that Ezequiel was given, are things that today we see in many teachers. We see many teachers that really get it, right? That they know that it's not about the students that are sitting in the first row. They really know that it's about everyone. They really know that it's about the interactions in the classroom. They really know that it's about making kids think in a different way, helping kids to learn how to learn permanently. The challenge is that that's not happening among all teachers, in all classrooms, in all schools. That's the tragedy. We do see fantastic teachers. However, we all have kids, or many of us have kids, and none of us, right, would like to have their kid or their their son or daughter in front of the teacher that is not having all those traits. So that is the huge challenge, that in the case of teachers, we cannot fail, right? Because if we fail, right, then in terms of supporting them, of giving them the right professional development opportunities, we're failing to a girl or to a boy, right? So that's the huge importance of all this work. Sometimes the challenge seems extremely big, because when we say that we need to make sure that all teachers have the right characteristics, the challenge is that we're not talking about 100 people. We're talking about, in a middle-sized country, like in my country, we'll talk about 500,000 people, right? And in a larger country, we're talking about millions of people. And we need to make sure that all those millions of people, that 500,000 people in a middle-sized country have the right characteristics. So sometimes one can see those systems in despair and thinking, look, it's so difficult to make those changes and make those reforms. But the point is that it's not impossible. Of course, it's difficult technically, politically, but it's not impossible, right? I mean, the typical example, and Annette was mentioned at the beginning, Finland. But what Finland said is, okay, at some moment 40 years ago, they said, we need to close our education institutions. We have too many, they're not as good enough, so let's close many of them, and let's have 8. And let's focus on having 8 very good universities, okay? That's a complex decision, but it's not an impossible decision, right? So it is now our job to making sure that there's the political will and the implementation capacity to change the structure of the career of teachers, right, in such a way that we really have the teachers in which that will have the right, not only be accountable, right, that will be trusted, right, as valued professionals. And a final point on this issue of this discussion about evaluation, right? I think, and even unions that you were mentioning, Justin, they should ask for more evaluation. The discussion should be, well, what's the right structure of that evaluation? I mean, they could say, no, it's very important that the principal should have the most important role on the evaluation of the teacher. There has to be more peer evaluation, that the evaluation has to be in order to improve the performance. Yes, of course, those discussions are extremely important, and it's something that we need to continue working, right? But we need to make sure that, as any professional, right, there is a structure in the system, right, that makes sure that everyone is observed in terms of its performance, because we need to make sure that that performance improves each time. And that is critical, because who is in front of these teachers are students, and they are our future, and they are the reason why we are all here. So thank you very much, Justin, for the moderation. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize I was closing up, but all right. Well, you know, as an outside observer, it's really exciting to see the bank thinking so systematically and kind of, I think, persuasively around the issues facing teacher recruitment, retention, training, motivation, with a really kind of deep evidence base and contributing to the public goods. I think, you know, the next time I run a school survey, I hope to spend some time with Teach and see if we can use it in the field. Thanks again to all of our panelists for being here, and to the presenters and everybody for joining. Thank you very much.